Hello, everyone. This is James. I'm actually getting prepared for all of you for today's lecture. I know we're currently, it's not the day of June 10th, but I decided to pre-record this ahead of time so all of you could access to this material in the lectures and this lesson plan. What we're going to talk about today is the June democracy movement happening. It happened in South Korea. And I do wanted to take a moment that, especially what's going on in the world, that we're actually commemorating the 35th anniversary of German democracy movement, but also what's going on throughout the entire world, especially with a lot of autocratic governments that are gaining a lot of traction lately, and a lot of trending news is happening all around the world. And we wanted to make sure that take this time to obviously to learn the lessons from the past, learn the histories of what South Korea actually gone through with the democracy movement in the past, and what we could learn in the present day, and how we can actually provide solution, and we could overcome the authoritarian movement that is going on around the world, how we can repair that solution to make sure that we have a stability and also have a civility dialogue, and have a conversation with the honest and trust with the truth information. So that's why we wanted to talk about the history of this commemoration of June democracy movement happening in South Korea at the time. So let's begin with no further ado, that we're going to start right away. Before we go into it, I actually have shown this map several times in my previous lectures. You could actually go onto my YouTube channel and actually look into my previous lectures that I did in the past 4 months right now, since I've been leading my own efforts to actually guide a lot of democracy lessons on how we could make sure that we could rebuild ourselves into a better institutions, and also democratic stability around the world. So this map has been shown multiple times. The real reason why I'm showing this, because currently we actually under a big threat, and also in trouble, democratic backsliding that we're seeing right now, especially what we're seeing in the map globally. This is according from the Economist Global Democracy Index. They do this every year periodically to show how many countries are about to be in threat of democratic backsliding, and a lot of authoritarian regimes that is getting traction around the world, and a lot of populist movement that we're also seeing across the globe. Because as an alternative, people are having less trust in the institution, because the institution have not represented the people, or have not willing to listen to the people's demands, and the trust that has been gaining from political, but also economically, socially, culturally as well. And that's why we're starting to see a lot of pulling away from the institution and getting more and more vibrant authoritarianism, and also deterioration of democratic institution. And that's actually even not a good thing right now, because what we saw in the presidential election of 2016 with Donald Trump's winning, and that actually got reverberated and actually got sent a shockwave throughout the world. Then basically that's a message that's saying that, hey, look at what we did. You know, what Trump has been doing and what he's been saying, it's all accepted with a xenophobia, ethnic tribalism, a lot of populist rhetoric, and also a lot of different hatred and violence that has been occurred, even including today, even after President Biden actually took office. He still has a lot of problems to deal with, a lot of challenges, especially with the recent gun violence that has been going on around the United States recently, that has been surrounded with a lot of hatred, but also a lot of I will say, forgot what the wording is, but I think there is a lot of anger amongst each other, because rising inflation, economic deterioration, more cynical towards each other because of lack of trust, disinformation on the internet, which is the biggest threat to our national interest, but also the security itself around the world that is going on to the internet, especially during the pandemic. You remember, obviously, when everything got shut down throughout the pandemic, everybody stayed at home. They relied on internet to actually rely on news information sources. The problem with a lot of global uh, people around the world is actually they don't fact check it or actually research it and do a deep investigation on whether the truth, whether the sources that they look into are factual and truth finding. And they don't do that a lot of deep research information. But for me, those education work came in earlier when I was actually probably around preschool all the way to throughout college years. We obviously take English as a mandatory course because they want us to get into learning a lot of deep research. That's been working for 12 years for me. Obviously, I've been through a lot of hardcore education throughout literature, even though literature in English is not my best subject for me. I had some struggle with it, but what it taught me was is that how important the fact checking and sourcing the citation of the information that you get from is actually fact checked, but also truthful information. So you actually get an accurate source of information that you get because you want to source it, but you also citate it so that way you know where the information is coming from. If the information is all made up, then unfortunately everybody believes in it. We're living a fantasy and narrative world for too many centuries and years. People believe in that stuff. But for me, I don't believe in those stuff because I wanted to rely on reliable information, but also truth and fact-finding information with the backup sources of fact, trustworthy sources, but also statistically and also research as well. And going back to the earlier regarding to a lot of polarization, a lot of deterioration of democratic institution because people don't trust the institution, but also they have a lot of grievances, especially around the world. That is the real reason why things are not going to what it used to be back in the pre-pandemic era. That goes all the way back to March 2020 when suddenly everything is starting to appear around the world that COVID started to take a hit on everyday lives, economically, politically, socially, culturally, everything's starting to hit on every sector of corner around the world. This is why you see a lot of populists, but also autocratic gaining traction around the world, saying that this is an alternative and how people should obviously lead the future. But unfortunately, historically, that has not been working at all throughout the last century. It's been 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in Russia. And we already know that, obviously, I'm not sure if everyone's history lesson has been taught in their own countries, but you pretty much know the fact that obviously when the rise of the internet came in, everybody could access the information, all of these things. Without the information of the internet, without the internet having existed, I think everyone would have not have been dealt with or have experience in research or finding information with the reliable sources, fact checking it, and also backing up with the sources of evidence. That what is important. And that is the thing that I've been taught in education in English classes and literature for many years. And that is the thing that is mandatory for classes in my personal experiences. But I think I'm thinking from the rest around the world, I'm not sure how the education system is curriculum onto the development plan, but I would assume that I think there's not enough education around the world, and unfortunately, that is the real reason why I'm doing this for free, basically for no charge for anyone who wants access to education materials I've been doing for many years. I obviously, a little bit of myself, I have been doing activism for many years, including nonprofit organizations serving as advisory board and board of directors and a lot of different types of advisement that I've been doing for many nonprofit organizations for over 20 years right now. It actually been going by fast. I started nonprofit sector service for at the age of 6 when I was in the Boy Scouts. Started from there and then obviously moved on and started to do a lot of volunteering and then moved my way up to the director and chairman position at, where I'm working at right now at PSEX as a volunteer. As a chairman. And basically, that is how much amount of efforts that have been sourced to make your way to actually becoming a top leadership position is within the executive. That is the hard work that I've been dealing with, but the amount of efforts it took me to actually get there to the point where I am as of today. So I think a lot of this discussion that I'm making right now is that, yes, democracy have some lot of flaws, and there's definitely a lot of instability around. around the world because they know that democracy and the current system has failed on us. That's something everyone will acknowledge, including myself, that the system has already faltered. And we need to transform and realign throughout the entire different sectors across the world, but also economy, culturally, politically, and socially, to the point that we need to realign everything. That includes, again, a total transformation and structural changes around the entire world based on how we do things, including our daily lives, because COVID already demonstrated and showed us that we are not living the old normal anymore. Those old normals are obviously gone. It is not business as usual. People are not participating and actively doing the stuff what they used to be. Now everything's got changed, and people need to acknowledge that. I know that's hard, but for me, I've been acknowledging that change is required and necessary for us to move on to the path to the direction for not only full democracy, but also a really vibrant economy and also having a good way of life for good living standards. And there's a lot of things to learn around the world. And I obviously been educated for that for many years. I've taken global classes, affairs, a lot of international relation classes. Even when in preschool, we taught about how to behave ourselves in civility, how to obviously respect each other, treat each other the way we wanted to be treated. I've been obviously educated in that. I've obviously been, grilled on that for many years. And that's why it helped me to obviously expand on my participation throughout the entire conferences. Everything's now switched to virtual. Not only participate on those type of conferences when it's virtual, so that way I'll be able to meet throughout the rest of the entire world for the past 2 years within the pandemic. That pandemic, even though, it's been a lot of sacrifice, a lot of death's been occurred, I do obviously send those condolences for those people who lost their lives throughout the rest of the 2 years. I know, obviously, I've been there. I've been seeing a lot of horrifying images. A lot of people are just basically dying because inactive participation from the government officials, that they were not willing to obviously take the urgency to the point that this was serious. This was a serious epidemic, to the point that they should have obviously done it earlier enough, that we should have taken the warning signs earlier. That's including the WHO and every global institution. They should have taken it urgently, but they just waited till the last minute and procrastinated and basically decided that obviously this is not important until they waited till the last minute, when then obviously when this became a pandemic, world spread across the world that the pandemic was a real issue, especially with COVID-19. We saw that, and because of inactions, lack of urgency, and a lot of lack of participation to trying to save that much amount of people, if we obviously took these issues seriously, if we took the pandemic issue seriously at the very early of the stage, this would not happen. There would have been no autocratic governments. There would have been no restrictions on the freedom of press, information, disinformation that was spreading around the world that people believe. That actually cost a lot of lives. Politics already cost a lot of lives for the last 2 years because of inaction from the government in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw that. I've been watching throughout the last 2 years, including previous pre-pandemic era, that I knew that autocratic regimes will be on the rise and it will be on the trending ever since before them. And I knew this was going to happen. I knew it was coming. Here's the thing, this is where we are right now. This is why I'm giving you this lecture, to actually learn about how democracy institutions have been formed, how they've fought, how the people have been lives have been sacrificed because they obviously fight for their lives to actually fight for democracy. That way, future generations and the next generation beyond that have a better way of living, but also having a better way of life. That is something that we should not forget. This is why obviously I'm fighting for make sure that we need to promote democracy around the world. When the politicians are trying to do so, it's less effective. That is a real reason why I'm trying to be advocate and trying to continue to have activism around the world, regardless of where you are. For those participants, if you're from across the world, this is why I'm here. This is why I'm fighting for democracy around the world. But also, I also do believe that it's not my job to tell you that this is all the plan that you need to do in order to secure democracy, or this is how we want you to do it based on our own methods. That is not what I'm here for. I'm here for not only to tell you the history of democracy but also in South Korea, but how they transform it into a better democracy and better way of life, but also a better way to actually make sure that the next generation does not falter into autocratic governments. Unfortunately, South Koreans have not already acknowledged that their country is already autocratic, but it's already autocratic government based on the trending in the news that have been following for many decades, including weeks, months leading up to the presidential election that they just had. And unfortunately, I think they've been, I wouldn't say the word scam, but I think they've been deceived by the politicians because of their rhetoric, thinking that they want to go back to the old type of thinking that a lot of hatred, xenophobia, and unfortunately hatred against among each other from gender issues and all of that stuff, thinking that is acceptable because of what Trump's election did in 2016 in the United States, that it got spread shockwaves around the world, thinking that that was accepted. That sent a bad message. We need to make sure that I do support Mr. Biden's efforts of trying to make sure we repair the alliance according to his inauguration speech that he did when he inaugurated in 2020. I mean, excuse me, 2021 in January when he assumed in office that day. Never forget that that what happened in Capitol Hill, that just happened obviously about a year ago. In that month, in January, when then the US Congress were trying to certify the election process, that they stormed the building and basically trying to attack, not only threaten congressional members, but also attacking one another because difference in ideas and lack of respect for the ideas and not willing to move forward with the election process. And they're calling election fraud. And this is similar to other countries around the world. They obviously deemed this was a fraud election, but unfortunately it's not. We need to make sure that we need to have established rule of law to make sure that we have respect, but also active participation in order to rebuild not only alliances around the world, but also to try to make sure that we lead a good global institution and makes it work for a better future of the future generation. That's what I'm here for. So this is the beginning, and I think pretty much over around the world, we started to see a lot of gaining traction on autocratic regimes. The statistically, according to the Global Democracy Institute from The Economist, what they're saying is only about 6.5% of around the world are living in full-fledged democracies. And unfortunately, this map can be outdated because right now we're in June. We're literally almost halfway there at the end of the year. And I will tell you, this map will totally change the landscape. Potentially, there will be more reds. There will be more shaded yellow or light yellow, I would say. There will be more shaded light blue and potentially could falter into hybrid democracy, hybrid regimes, and also could falter into, I would say, a more dangerous catastrophe where there will be a failed states and failed democracies. How are we going to do that? By willing to obviously attending these classes and lectures that I do in order to make sure that not only raise awareness, but also to make sure that we educate around the people around the world that this is how we obviously need to make sure that we have a solution, but also provide a lot of solutions in order to overcome this. So this is why I'm doing this for a reason. Now there's a little introduction about what's going on with Global Democracy Index. And this is the beginning of why I'm fighting for, to make sure that we educate and also spreading advocacy throughout the world that democracy is obviously still important to our people, but also it can be worked, it can be done, but it's going to take a lot of efforts and a lot of time in order to make sure that it's going to go back to the pre-pandemic era. Now, it won't be the same, but I think we could rebuild the institution and we could rebuild for our generation. So that way the future generation will not have to suffer, but also have to suffer the same consequences that we're going through right now. There will be periods of setbacks, and we understand that, but that's how life it works. We'll always have this challenges, a lot of resilience, but we have the ability to overcome it. That's why I'm here for it, and that's why I'm giving you today's lecture. Now, going straight directly to the South Korean's democracy, how it got formed, how it got rebuilt, and throughout all this transformation process. Let's take a brief history of what was going on in South Korea at the time. South Korea, of course, including the Korean Peninsula, including that's North Korea as well. Both Koreas obviously been both Koreas were all been exploited by colonialism era. This is happening around the world. We saw a lot of colonist countries taking advantage and exploiting other countries because of economic, political, social, and militarily to trying to make sure that they have this great power competition for having an us versus them mentality. And that's dangerous. We know that competition is good for sports, but unfortunately, reality in politics is really dangerous. Not only it just increases xenophobia and hatred amongst each other, but also the lack of trust in the public institution, but also the lack of trust in global institutions like WHO and other global institution that we've been relying on to help us to prevent from another world war that is going to happen. That is the real reason why previous generation have been built, but I think we could make it better. In this country, obviously in South Korea, they've been going through a huge trial and error process to try to figure out what is the best way and how we can make sure we engineer to a better democracy and better institutions. That was going on for nearly 75 years, ever since the formation of the Republic of Korea that had been established under a new government with the assistance from the US military, because the US military was under control in South Korea at the time, and within the Southern Korea. Soviet Union took over in the north because of the participation in World War II with the Japanese fighting against them to actually overcome that defeat. And after that, after the constant debate about how the Korea should be formed, how the republic, how the government should be established, and how the people can participate, that has been a lot of conflicts, and that has been ongoing debate for many years. Even till today, it's still an ongoing debate how the Korean Peninsula should be reunified, how it should be. Obviously, we could prepare for our future readiness for making sure that if we reunify, how are we gonna disperse and spread different types of ideas and methods and solutions in order to make sure that we have a better living standard, but also a better economic conditions and prosperity for the future generation for many years to come. They've been going through a lot of trial and error, as I mentioned, through authoritarianism and going back and forth. And basically, this was a huge power competition and power political party leadership that has been going on. And of course, that's the real reason why this was a struggle. This was a power struggle, I would say. Not only because they were facing competition with North Korea during the 70s and 80s, or actually way better than Southern Korea, but authoritarianism for them, it was necessary in order to overcome and battle with economic prosperity, but also national security and try to be the better will of the people. And that's why they did it for that reason. But in today's world, if authoritarianism come into a way, it does not solutionize with the economy. It does not get better. You cannot have authoritarianism in order to better have sacrifice for economic and obviously political situations. You can't, because it does not work. You have a good economic conditions and also good political stability in order to have a good foundation of a democracy. In the previous generation, had to sacrifice it, but they overcome it. But this time, for our future generation and beyond that, it does not add the equation. And unfortunately, you need to have a good economic condition, political stability in order to have a good foundation of your life and prosperity. This has been going on for many years under Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan. Unfortunately, this is why there has been a lot of outcry and a lot of grievances and discontent. That obviously, that's why there has been a lot of power struggle within South Korea at the time. There has been a death of Park Chung-chul, which I will talk about a little bit, what was going on at the time that led to a lot of outcry and the spread of protests and activism. And then it started to flare up around other regions within Korea that actually led to a greater movement, a largest movement in many years in South Korean history. Of course, there has been a lot of disapproval. This is why Chun's military regime and his legitimacy in South Korea has not been accepted at the very beginning during the Yushin Constitution. The death of Han Yeon, of course, this was also another person that actually made it possible to make sure that the protests had gotten bigger to actually propose select changes. And that's the real reason why there has been discussion going on, why there was a proposed successor for the next presidential nominee to secure the position. That was Roh Tae-woo at the time. He was Chun Doo-hwan's best friend. I would say a teammate. In the military, they get along with each other. he picked his successor in order to maintain the control of the power, not only politically, but also economically, to say that he should be taking all the credit for granted. But unfortunately, that did not get accepted. And also during Korea at the time, when throughout since the beginning of 50s and during the Korean War, it has been gone a lot of tremendous amount of sacrifice, but also there has been a period of economic income inequality, polarization politically because of power struggles and power competition between two political parties. And unfortunately, because the instability that was going on at the time after the post-Korean War era, Korea has been gone through a lot of sacrifice, but also the suffering of a lot of instability that was going on because they were trying to rebuild the country after the causes of the post-Korean War era. And that's why there has been a lot of political and social instability, but also economically. And this is why authoritarianism was the answer solution to in order to lighten the people's heart and also follow the prosperity for future generation. But we know that history tells us that authoritarianism, the totalitarianism, or communism, or any ideology control one government did not work, because we've been going through trials and errors and also experimenting this for many years, and still again it came back. But we do know that it will prevail, that justice will prevail, but also democracy and also truth, the rule of law will obviously prevail. That it's going to take many years to get the results that we needed to go to the point that democracy has worked. It will prevail. It's just required us to advocate and trying to strive for change for that. That is what we need. And that's why I'm fighting for it. And this is what I've been doing for many years already. In regards to that, in addition, of course, I mentioned movements just been started. June Democracy Act started after Kwangju democratization movement, but Korea has been going through a lot of struggles and a lot of protest movement even before this, during this time, during the Yushin Constitution, because there have been a lot of citizen resistance. There was an indirect presidential election because it was actually one party. It was based on one authoritarian. It was an authoritarian system that had been relying on basically the president himself during Park Geun-hye's time. He obviously chose his own judicial. He nominated and confirmed his own congressional members. It was a one-man system, basically. It was taking control of the entire government, and there's no accountability force, checks and balances. There have been massive abuse on state violence, suppressing against protesters, citizens, ordinary people, you name it, all across the board from different stakeholders been violated. But there also is a continuation from censoring the press media during the Chun's regime at the time. During his military dictatorship, he suppressed it. He also introduced 3S policy, which is basically sex, screen, and also I forgot, sports. He introduced those things in order to try to dissuade people and trying to prevent people from participating in politics. They wanted saying, hey, we're going to give you a good life, have a good lifestyle, the end. Basically, they want you to watch television, they want you to watch sports, have all these things in order to make sure that people enjoy their life, but also leisure time and don't focus on too much politics. That's what Chun's regime is trying to send a message. But that is the real reason why a lot of people have been disinterested policy, because, you know, why is it obviously important to me? It's not affecting me, but today's world, it is impacting everyone already right now. And unfortunately, a lot of people still have not gone into that mindset yet. That's a situation, but unfortunately, we could do better to formulate that message into different audiences. That's going to take a lot of effort, and that's what we need to have a team for that. I cannot do this all by my own, but we can have a formation of a team in order to make sure that we could send a message to each different audiences. Throughout this time, of course, literature and books were banned based on any anti-government or dissidents were protesting against opposition government or anything critical to the government, to the point that you're not allowed to talk about it. Widespread human abuse have been violated. A lot of political activities, freedom of speech and assembly were prohibited. They also been taken over to the National Assembly, which is congressional legislative. Basically, they take control of that to prevent people to represent their own constituencies. It was a one-man authoritarian role. It was completely to trying to cover up any talking about critical government activities, and basically not allowed to cover any negativity regarding to Chun's political image that was going on at the time. So I talked about the overall causes why people have been frustrated. So I'll talk about the background itself, what led to this. Throughout basically prior to this, there has been a lot of series of unfortunate events. Of course, I talked about the Yushin Constitution, which what that is basically it's just a one-man dictatorship role. Congressional checks and system and balances were obviously violated. They just basically saying that one presidential executive position, basically the president controls the entirety of the government, legislative, judicial, everything is being confirmed by himself, but also everything is controlled under the government. That's including broadcasting system, the press, everything is all controlled. That is the real reason why we're still having some impacts today because of that controlling the past control of that censorship model. There have also been a series of coup d'etat events. Of course, May 16 coup d'etat, this was led by Park Geun-hye and his men, of course, military people that actually overthrew the Second Republic and now obviously creation of the Third Republic. And obviously because there has been an attempt to well, I wouldn't say attempt, but there was an attempt to assassination. Park Geun-hye actually got assassinated during the 1979, during the October month, when somebody from his own men, his internal government body, from the KCIA director, he actually assassinated because potentially, I think it was opposition to the government's Yushin Constitution. Then later on, there has been another coup d'etat, two of the events, December 12th, May 17th. December 12th is the one that trying to get rid of pro-government during the Park Geun-hye's era, the involvement during that time. And basically the May 17th coup d'etat is also regard to basically they're trying to create a martial law. And that's led to widespread constitutional violation, human rights, suspension of the Constitution, violating the National Assembly, but also enforcement, lack of enforcement for government checks and balance system, deterioration of rule of law, civil rights also being violated throughout this time. But in addition to prior to that, there has been a brief period of transition, and it's a good opportunity for people to to spread some activism saying that this was the time for us to transition into democracy and demand for political reforms. That was the Seoul Spring era. Brief period, it lasted about 5 months. Then prior to that, there was a martial law that's been declared and basically banned political activities, no school, and also basically censorship. And then obviously there was a May 18 democratization movement happening in Gwangju at the time, and basically this was in the 1980s. This is the time when I've seen the people, citizens there, actually rose up and basically saying that they demand political reform and changes to the constitution. And it also was first nearly during this military dictatorship era from the 60s to the 70s and 80s, it was an indirect presidential election where basically there was no election. It was based on congressional members voting for the president itself. Also, there has been a brief period, as I was mentioned earlier, labor movement, activism, social reform, a lot of different types of transformational reform from every single stakeholder from each different sectors have came forth and saying that we need to change. The leadership vacuum was also a brief period during the 70s because they were trying to figure out who could be the next leader to repair the government institution itself. There also been a power struggle between authoritarianism, of course, and the democracy, which is better than one or the other. This was our first mentality that I was talking about. And there has been a constant struggle, even today. What is the best choice for people to actually have a better prosperity, a better way of life, the living standard? This is why one of the things that has been going on for debate for years and years, and this will continue to debate for future generation as well. As I was mentioning, massive human rights are abused, and they also disarmed political parties and national election. There was no election. It was not fair. It was not free. It was all corrupt based on one man. And I already talked about this earlier. Then specifically later on, there will be two people who actually died because of torture, but also brutality from the police that was going on. These two people, that was Lee Han-yeol and Park Chung-cheol. We'll talk about in detail. Then there was also chanting for democratic reforms. Then this led to the June 29th declaration, which talks about a lot of different things. So let me go back to, so we already talked about briefly about a lot of these type of, these series of events that led to the June democracy movement. Now we're going to talk about the June 29th declaration. What this was is basically presidential contender at the time, Rotate, who was obviously the guy who was John Doohan's best friend, basically, he was chosen as his successor. During the time, he was actually heard of people's demands, and throughout this time when there was a series of protests spreading around across different regions and now become a national movement, he actually was aware of it, and he actually made several concessions throughout that congressional meeting and politician throughout the different types of series of meetings to actually conclude that, okay, we listen to the people and we actually were going to provide concessions through these different types of reforms. Democratic reforms, that means we're going to restore the civil rights and human rights. That's including ending of censorship, restore the freedom of press, but also having the right presidential election for the first time in 16 years, ever since the Yushin Constitution got dissolved and disbanded. They decided that obviously this is the will of the people. We must respect to their, we must provide a respect to them. That's why they also introduced fair and free election system. They got rid of all the dictator, one-man draconian law that basically just completely said that this is not right for the people. We want to provide a lot of democratic restoration to the people. That's what they did. They also been a social reform. There has been labor activism, increase in union membership, but also permanent strikes that have been going on throughout the Chinese regime throughout 8 years to demand social reform and have a better waging condition, also have a better working conditions. All of this, because of this June 29 declaration, they amended the Constitution. They also made a lot of several attempts to make a lot of reforms, which later came into a new era. And after the amendment of the Constitution, it became known as Sixth Republic, which is the current era of the current government. There has been discussion whether they should be a Seventh Republic of Korea at the time, after Park Geun-hye's impeachment that was going in 2016, that led to a lot of serious movement at the time. But unfortunately, the Constitution had not been amended or changed or reformed since after this decade in 1989. That was the last time it had been amended. So what is the June democracy movement? What it is you need to know is it took about at least 30, probably 30 days or 29 days from starting from June 10th to 29th. That was the start in 1987. This was a series of political, social, economic, and cultural reforms that have been going on. It was a nationwide movement of democracy that wanted to make sure that it's been a massive protest been going on throughout this period that took about 30 days in order to demand a lot of social, economic, political, and social cultural reforms to say that we want to hold election, we want to have fair and free judicial. That's including making sure that have direct presidential election. These were several reforms that have been demanded, and it took about 30 days for them to make sure that the government say, okay, we listened to you, we heard your demands, we provide concession. That was led to the June 29th declaration. And obviously that put a lot of pressure on the military regime to say, obviously, they were trying to figure out ways to beat around the bush and saying that, look, I don't care about what the people say, or that's what Chen would say. And his April 13 constitutional resignation, that he said that, nope, obviously I'm not going to obviously follow what the people's demands are. I'm going to stay in power. I'm going to do whatever I can in order to try to dissuade people to say, you could still elect me and obviously for a limited amount of term, but unfortunately people did not buy into that because his April 13th resignation constitution, he just did not